It was in the damp spring of 1891, during a spell of peculiar lethargy which had settled upon Baker Street, that the case of the girl who spoke in riddles first emerged unbidden, enigmatic, and draped in the sort of mystique that always stirred my companion from his ennui. Holmes had taken to the violin again not for music, but for torment. The dissonant scraping of bow against string echoed through our chambers in waves of increasing intensity, broken only by the occasional staccato rattle of the Times as he snapped it open to examine the latest political absurdities or scandalous deaths with equal disdain. As for me, I occupied the armchair by the hearth, seeking distraction in a volume on tropical medicine when the first sign of the case quite literally tapped upon our window. It was not the brisk knock of a visitor at the door, but a gentle, almost apologetic tapping on the window pane. I turned instinctively. The rain blurred the image beyond the glass, but a pale face loomed behind it, a girl no older than 20, soaked to the bone, her expression caught between panic and awe. Holmes was on his feet before I could speak, flinging the window open with such suddenness that the girl stumbled forward and collapsed into the sitting room. "Mrs. Hudson," I called instinctively, rushing to lift the young woman, whose delicate form shivered like a leaf in a gale. Holmes, however, knelt beside her and studied her with a gaze as clinical as it was penetrating. "Not from London," he murmured, lifting a damp hem of her skirt. "Country cut. Cambridge. Perhaps no. East Anglia. Fenland soil on the hem, barley pollen on the collar. And Watson, do come closer." She's clenching something in her right hand. Indeed, she was. With great care, Holmes pried open her fingers to reveal a scrap of thick, creamy paper, the edge torn jaggedly, as if it had been wrenched from a larger sheet. Upon it were the following words, penned in a hand as elegant as it was, cryptic. "If the well is dry, look to the mirror. What waits beneath has seen you before." She was repeating it, Holmes said, almost to himself, over and over again beneath her breath as she came up the steps. I thought it was the wind, but no, it was a riddle, and from the look of her, Watson, I'd wager her mind is closer to collapse than recovery. By now, Mrs. Hudson had arrived with a blanket, and the girl, gently roused, seemed to find comfort in the warmth. She opened her eyes, bright, grey, wide, and looked directly at Holmes. "I was told you would understand," she whispered. "But he said you might be too late." "Who said?" I asked. She blinked slowly, her lips parting, but what came out was no name. Instead, another riddle, murmured as though reciting a prayer. "A room with no key, a face with no name. Find the one who smiles in flame." Holmes' brows arched ever so slightly. "This," he said, almost delighted, "is not madness. Not yet. She has memorized these fragments. Not hallucinated them, preserved them. Someone fed her these riddles purposefully. Watson, perhaps as warnings or instructions." I looked at her again, dripping wet, trembling, whispering riddles with the conviction of scripture, and felt a chill unlike that from the rain. "But why? And from whom?" I said. "That," Holmes replied, rising to his full height and tossing the scrap of paper onto the mantel, "is precisely what we are going to find out. But first, Watson, help me with a small experiment. I would wager her boots hold the next clue. And Mrs. Hudson, if she might spare a kettle. We have riddles to unravel, and I work best with tea." And so it began, the case which would lead us into cryptic codes, forgotten estates, and the twisting corridors of a mind entangled in mystery. A case that would see Holmes matched not in logic, but in language. Holmes motioned for me to bring the girl's boots nearer, and I did so with care, placing the muddy, weather-beaten footwear upon a page of the Times to preserve our carpet. He bent low, examining the soles with his magnifying lens, his brows knitting with that expression I had come to know well, the sharpening focus of a mind entering the folds of deduction. "There," he said, pointing to a small, angular indentation upon the edge of the heel. "Do you see, Watson? A triangular wedge, very faint, cut into the mud, though it predates the soil layers from her walk to Baker Street. Not the mark of a cobblestone, nor a misstep. Rather, something intentional. A stamp, perhaps." "A stamp," I repeated. "You mean something pressed into her heel?" "Precisely. Something small, likely placed while she was unaware or unconscious. If we had a mirror—" "I'll fetch one," I said, already moving to the washstand. When I returned, Holmes was delicately brushing the heel with a dampened cloth. With the mirror held beneath it and the angle adjusted, we could just discern faint letters embedded into the dried leather by that same triangular depression. K. W. C. Holmes's eyes lit up. K. W. initials, possibly. It's most likely a place. Kingston Wharf? Camden? Cambridge? He looked up at the girl, who now sat silent, her grey eyes fixed upon the fire. She had not spoken again since her earlier utterance. A distant, almost mournful calm had come over her, as though she no longer expected to be understood. "Miss," Holmes said gently, seating himself beside her, "we mean to help you. Can you tell us your name?" She did not respond immediately. Her gaze lingered on the flickering flames, and when she spoke, it was not an answer, but another riddle. Two brothers built a house of glass. One vanished. One looked back. Holmes glanced at me with interest. There's something almost mythic about these verses, as if someone wanted to communicate truth concealed in metaphor. "I'm not sure it's communication at all," I murmured. "These might be fragments of a mind unraveling." "No, Watson," Holmes replied. "They are fragments of a design, and like all designs, they may be traced back to a single hand. The trick lies in recognizing the brushstroke." He turned again to the girl. "Miss, if you cannot give us your name, then tell us. Did someone bring you to London?" A tremor passed across her lips. He came in shadows, dressed in smoke. The clock struck 2, and no one spoke. Holmes rose suddenly and crossed the room, where he pulled down Barclay's Directory of East Anglia. He flipped rapidly through the pages, scanning entries in Fenland towns, until his finger landed upon something that made his lips curl slightly. Kenton Woodcroft. Crowsbury. A private estate. About 5 miles north of Ely. Note the initials, Watson, K.W., and Crowsbury, of course, begins with C. You believe that is where she came from? More than believe. Her clothing is of good but outdated make, suited to a household of restrained aristocratic means. That, combined with the Fenland soil, points to the countryside likely isolated. But what seals it is the style of verse. This isn't madness, it's method. Her words have meter and precision, not rambling nonsense. I glanced again at the slip of paper. What waits beneath has seen you before. There was an eeriness to it, an almost oracular tone. "But why send her in such a state?" I asked. "If someone wanted to hire you, why not come directly?" Holmes regarded me with that familiar smile, never mocking, always patient. "Because, Watson, they do not want her to be believed. Or, perhaps more interestingly, they want her to be believed only partially, enough to make us curious, not enough to reveal the truth. What we have here is a cipher disguised as delirium." There came a knock at the door, and a moment later, Inspector Lestrade entered in his usual hurried manner. His coat was still speckled with rain, and he carried with him the scent of wet boots and urgency. "Holmes, I've a case that might interest you," he began before stopping mid-stride, his eyes falling upon the girl on our settee. "Good Lord, what's this? Is she all right?" "She will be," I said, "though her words will give you pause. She speaks in riddles," Holmes added, already returning to his violin with renewed focus. "Much like the man I believe brought her here. But let's hear your case, Lestrade. I have a feeling it's not unrelated." The inspector gave Holmes a curious look, but did not question it. He had long since learned that resistance to Holmes's intuition was a futile pursuit. Well, it's a strange one, I admit, Lestrade said. Lady Frances Derwent was found dead in her private conservatory late last night, poisoning, it seems, though the details are irregular. Her brother insists it was murder, though there's no sign of forced entry or disturbance. Holmes stopped tuning his violin. Where? Cambridge. The estate is called, wait, I have it here, Crowsbury Lodge. My eyes met Holmes's instantly. Crowsbury, I said. K.W.C. Lestrade looked bewildered. What's that now? Holmes rose with sharp, precise purpose. All languor vanished. Lestrade, you will return to Scotland Yard and request all available records on the Woodcroft family and their connections to the Crowsbury estate. Meanwhile, Watson and I shall accompany this young lady under protection, of course, back to Cambridge. There is a tapestry being woven here, and someone is hiding behind the threads. Lestrade grunted. Always 2 steps ahead, eh, Holmes? Not 2 steps. Merely in the direction of logic. Come, Watson, we have a house of riddles to examine, and time, I fear, is no longer on our side. The girl, now quiet, allowed herself to be wrapped in another blanket as Holmes helped her gently to her feet. As we descended the stairs of 221B Baker Street, the rain had ceased, but the wind carried the scent of something older than storm, something ancient, deliberate, and watching. And thus we set out toward Crowsbury, toward riddles and riddled men, and toward a death whose silence would soon be broken. The journey to Crowsbury unfolded beneath a slate-colored sky that threatened rain but never delivered it. The land stretched out before us, flat and brooding, interrupted only by thin black hedgerows and the occasional wind-bent tree. Holmes remained contemplative for the greater part of the trip, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin, eyes half closed in thought. The girl, who still had not given a name, sat silently across from us, her face pale but composed, her gaze trained on the window as though reading meaning in every passing field and furrow. It was just past 4 in the afternoon when the carriage turned onto a long gravel drive, flanked by crumbling stone gateposts and a line of yew trees grown unruly in their age. The house itself appeared through the mist like something out of a fever dream, tall, narrow, and symmetrical, with a glass-roofed conservatory affixed to one side like a watchful eye. Even at a distance, it radiated melancholy. We were met at the door by a man who, at first glance, seemed carved from the same material as the house, stiff, austere, and slightly mottled by time. He introduced himself in a clipped voice as Mr. Thaddeus Woodcroft, brother to the late Lady Frances and, as we soon learned, the de facto master of Crowsbury Lodge since their father's death. "I was told to expect you," he said, looking not at Holmes but at the girl who had hung back near the carriage. "Though I cannot say I understand why she is with you. I had her removed for her own protection." Holmes smiled without warmth. "And yet she found her way to Baker Street, a journey of considerable length and complexity in the midst of a storm. That alone should raise questions." Thaddeus's jaw tightened. "She's a servant, or was. A companion, perhaps, though my sister insisted on calling her a muse. Frances was fond of theatrical affectations. She never gave us her name," I said. The man sighed, clearly irritated. "Her name is Eliza Dane, taken in by my sister some months ago after a performance in town. She read riddles at some rural fair and captivated Frances beyond reason. That's when the madness began." "Madness?" Holmes asked, his tone sharpening. She began locking the doors to the conservatory, whispering to herself, writing messages on the underside of teacups. She even sent herself letters, addressed in her own hand, but signed with the initials S.F., the very letters carved above the old hearth in the west wing. S.F., Holmes echoed softly. "Not your initials. Not hers either." "Exactly. That's why I assumed, well, perhaps an old suitor, or someone from before. I had the letters burned. I regret that now. Holmes's expression turned unreadable. And her death? Thaddeus hesitated. She was found yesterday morning, slumped beside the conservatory's marble basin. Her cup was half full. The doctor says it was aconitine monkshood. A gardener's poison, though none of the plants here are missing any. No sign of forced entry. Nothing stolen. She drank alone. She always did. Eliza had remained on the drive until Holmes called to her, gently. She walked with halting steps toward the door, and though her expression remained impassive, I saw her knuckles whiten around the edges of her shawl as we stepped into the house. Inside, the air was heavy with age and lilac, mingling strangely with something colder, metallic and bitter, like scorched iron. We were shown to the conservatory. It was an elegant but decaying room of glass and iron, filled with dusky palms and long shadows. Near the center stood the marble basin, a wide, shallow vessel, dry now, but stained faintly with residue. Beside it, a single teacup remained, untouched. Holmes went immediately to it, lifting it delicately by the handle and holding it to the light. No visible traces of residue. Watson, perhaps you'd care to examine it when we return to London? Of course, I said, taking mental note of its clean lines, its delicate glazing, unusual for poison to leave no physical trace. He turned then to the floor, eyes narrowing as he crouched low. With a handkerchief, he touched a corner of the Persian rug near the basin and brought it to his nose. Soap, he murmured. Lie. Someone scrubbed this floor, and recently. Thaddeus frowned. The maid was instructed to clean the room after the body was removed. Holmes stood slowly. And the maid, is she available to speak with us? I'm afraid she left this morning. In quite a state. Claimed to have seen Lady Frances after her death, walking past the conservatory window at midnight. Holmes gave a quiet laugh. So we are dealing not only with riddles, but with ghosts. He turned to Eliza. Miss Dane, or shall I say, Miss Riddlesinger, what do you remember of the night Lady Frances died? She looked at the basin, then at the windows above, where the last light of day filtered in through dust-streaked panes. She was waiting, she said at last, her voice thin and firm. She said the mirror was ready. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Mirror? What mirror? In her study. She'd placed one on the ceiling above the fireplace. She called it the Watcher. Said it would show her who was real and who was wearing masks. We followed Eliza to the west wing, a colder, more abandoned part of the house. The walls were lined with books no one had touched in decades, and the doors creaked as if in protest. The study was dark, with long velvet curtains drawn against the evening. Holmes moved quickly, lighting the lamp and pulling back the drapes. Above the fireplace, just as she'd said, was a great oval mirror fixed to the ceiling with brass hooks and heavy chain. Holmes stood beneath it and looked up for a long moment. It's convex, he said, wide-angled. A mirror designed not for vanity, but for surveillance. She could see the entire room without moving. He turned to the desk, rifling through drawers, until he found a black leather folio. Inside were pages of strange verse, torn from a larger volume, each line in Lady Frances's hand. One stood out, scribbled hastily in the margin, separate from the others. When he enters, dressed in fire, do not speak, do not conspire. Leave the door upon the latch, or Riddle dies without the match. Holmes read it twice, then looked to Eliza. Did she ever mention a man who came in fire? Eliza hesitated. Then, in the stillness, she murmured, only once. She said he wore no face, only smoke. That he brought matches but never lit a flame. Holmes closed the folio. Then we must find him. And quickly. The wind rattled the windows above us then, and for a brief second I thought I saw movement in the mirror, not a trick of reflection, but something behind it. Holmes stared at it, unmoving, the flickering lamplight reflected in his eyes. Watson, he said quietly, someone has been watching this house long before the poison was poured. We've stepped into a game already in progress, and if I'm not mistaken, the next riddle will be written in ash. We left the study in silence, with Eliza between us, and I could not shake the feeling that every shadow we passed was holding its breath. Holmes remained contemplative as we made our way back down the dim corridor from the west wing, Eliza's light footsteps padding behind us like a shadow that dared not break the hush. The folio he carried Lady Frances's riddles and writings was clutched tightly in his gloved hand, protected from the draught and dust as if it were some sacred relic. The hour had grown late, and the house, with its long, echoing halls and breathless stillness, began to take on the air of a tomb. We returned to the drawing room where a fire had been lit in our absence. Thaddeus had taken to the corner armchair and was reading, or pretending to read, a volume of Cicero. He looked up at us with no pretense of curiosity. "You've seen the study, then?" he asked. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and more importantly, we've seen the mirror." Thaddeus raised an eyebrow. My sister's little eccentricity. Holmes set the folio gently on the side table. "Not so little, I think. Tell me, Mr. Woodcroft, was there anyone your sister feared?" Thaddeus hesitated, just for a heartbeat, and then gave a dismissive wave. "Francis saw ghosts in shadows and murder in the call of every owl. Ever since the incident with our father," Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Your father?" Thaddeus sighed, clearly irritated with himself. "He died here 2 years ago. An accident, though Francis always said otherwise. He fell from the staircase in the bell tower while attending to repairs. She believed someone had tampered with the railing. Was there an investigation? Of course, local constable ruled it a tragic misstep. And you?" "I was in London at the time. Francis had summoned me home that evening, oddly enough. Said she had seen the truth, written in a dream. When I arrived, it was to the news that he was already dead." Holmes gave a small nod, filing the detail away. I knew that expression. He had just fitted a piece into his mental map. The question was, to what picture? Eliza, seated by the fire now with a shawl around her shoulders, looked up and spoke for the first time in some time. She said he came back. Thaddeus flinched. "Don't listen to her." Francis became convinced. Our father's ghost haunted the conservatory. She'd leave him messages in riddles on mirrors, behind paintings, even in the basin itself. "Did she ever mention a name?" Holmes asked. Eliza nodded. "Once. She whispered it to me after one of her fits. She said, 'He wears the name of the man I never saw. He lives behind smoke.'" Holmes turned slightly toward the fire, his expression distant, then suddenly snapped his fingers and stepped to the side table. "I would like to see the chimney," he said. Thaddeus looked up. "The conservatory's fireplace? It hasn't been used in years. All the better. If someone has used it recently, say, to destroy evidence, the signs will be obvious. Watson, would you come with me?" It was nearly midnight, and the corridors were colder now, the hush deeper. The conservatory had taken on an eerie stillness, and Holmes's footsteps echoed softly as he approached the fireplace. He examined the hearth with deliberate care, brushing away soot, peering into the flue, and then, without warning, reached up into the chimney throat with his arm. He withdrew a small, folded paper, stained and half-charred, the edges crumbling as he opened it with great delicacy. The ink was smeared, but some of the lines remained legible. "I have watched you dance with riddles, but the answer bleeds from mirrors. When the bells toll once more, the smoke shall speak." Holmes exhaled slowly. "So it was used, and recently, someone has been intercepting her riddles or perhaps replying to them. What do you make of the smoke shall speak?" Holmes glanced up the chimney again. "That depends. How far is the bell tower?" "Just across the east garden," I said. "Near the chapel ruins." He nodded. "Then that's where we go next." The grounds were sodden but passable, and we crossed them with lanterns in hand. The bell tower stood stark against the moonlit sky, ivy curling like claws around its crumbling stone. The old wooden door yielded with a groan, and we stepped inside, greeted by the heavy scent of damp timber and the rustle of disturbed birds above. The staircase spiraled upward precariously, and Holmes ascended with surprising speed. I followed more cautiously, the boards groaning beneath each step. At the top, beneath the great brass bell, Holmes examined the railing. "There," he said, pointing to the baluster post. "It's been replaced. See the difference in wood grain?" I crouched beside it. "Newer," just as Thaddeus said after the father's fall. Holmes turned slowly in place, sweeping his lantern along the stonework. "Notice anything peculiar?" he asked. The wall near the bell was etched, faint lines scratched into the stone, forming a crude diagram. At first, it looked like some childish drawing. Circles, arrows, a series of slanted lines. But as Holmes held the lantern closer, I saw it clearly. "A map. To the study," Holmes whispered. "Look at the lines, stairs, passage, fireplace, and there what appears to be Watson. This may be a hidden access point. You believe someone used it to spy on her?" Holmes didn't answer directly. He moved to the trapdoor above the belfry and shoved it open. Cold air rushed down from the night, carrying with it a faint smell, burnt paper, and unmistakably paraffin. We climbed onto the roof cautiously. The bell loomed above us like a suspended omen. Holmes knelt at the edge, his fingers tracing along the stone coping, and then he paused. "A recess," he murmured. "And look here, soot marks. Someone stood here often. Smoked, perhaps. Watched. Watched the conservatory?" I asked. "No," he said, rising and pointing. "Watched the study. From this vantage, one can see through the upper study window if the curtain is drawn." I stared out into the darkness. The landscape lay quiet, but the sense of being watched was unmistakable. Holmes looked at me and said grimly, "This isn't just a murder, it's a theater of riddles, smoke, and observation. And every actor has their part, especially the one we haven't seen yet." We returned to the house, chilled and winded. The dawn not far off. Holmes, though physically weary, looked more animated than I had seen in days. He lit a cigarette and paced the parlor. "Someone constructed this entire framework," he said. "Used Francis's fascination with riddles to communicate, taunt, or guide. But there is a pattern beneath it, and I suspect the final message has yet to be delivered. Eliza may know more than she realizes," I said. "What she's said, smoke, mirror, bell, they all correspond to what we've just seen." Holmes nodded slowly. "And then there's the match. The riddle dies without the match. Perhaps a person," I offered. "Perhaps, or perhaps, a second code, a cipher key. We must not discount the literal when facing the symbolic. For now, we rest. Tomorrow, we speak to the gardener, the remaining staff, and revisit the chapel ruins." He tapped the folio once more, and then looked to the fire, where the last of the coals glowed dimly. "When smoke becomes signal, Watson, the match may already be lit." We rose with the grey light of dawn filtering through the drapes of our rooms at Crowsbury Lodge, the air heavy with that peculiar stillness that always seems to precede the unraveling of a great puzzle. Holmes had slept little, if at all. I found him seated at the small writing desk. The folio of Lady Francis's riddles spread before him, a half-burned candle still guttering in its holder. He looked up, and though his features bore the faint pallor of exhaustion, his eyes were sharp, alert, almost feverishly so. "I've restructured the verses," he said without preamble, gesturing toward the pages. "Chronologically, as best I can. There's a rhythm to them, a sequence that follows the progression of her thoughts. Here, listen." He pointed to one passage. "Smoke without flame, face without name. In glass he watches, yet leaves no frame." And then, a later verse. "The bell rang twice, though none did pull. My mirror knows my mind is full." She was tracking something, Holmes continued, not merely hallucinating. She believed herself observed and attempted to record it without triggering her observer's suspicion. The riddles are encoded warnings, not madness strategy. Just then, a knock sounded at the door, and Eliza entered, her face drawn and pale but composed. "He was in the garden," she whispered. "I saw him from the east corridor. A tall man, wearing a coat like shadows. I think he knew I saw him." Holmes stood instantly, already pulling on his coat. "Watson, fetch your revolver." We followed Eliza's direction and exited into the morning mist, boots crunching over gravel and damp earth as we crossed the lawn. The eastern gardens bordered the ruined chapel, an ancient stone shell, now reduced to a skeleton of arches and ivy-choked walls. There, amid the vines and cracked flagstones, Holmes bent and examined the soil. "Fresh," he murmured. "The weight of a man, judging by the depth. Long stride, too." He moved quickly, but not in panic. "And here, Watson, do you see?" I crouched beside him and noticed it at once. A single, half-smoked match lying atop the stone ledge of a broken wall. Holmes retrieved it with tweezers from his pocket, examining its charred tip. "Eliza," he said, turning to her. "Describe him again." He was tall. His face was obscured. I think he wore a scarf, pulled high, and a cap. But there was something odd about the way he moved. He didn't flinch when I spotted him. It was as if he wanted to be seen. Holmes nodded. "He is drawing us forward, step by step, but he underestimates the depth of our stride." We swept the chapel remains thoroughly, and though we found no further sign of the man, Holmes paused near the altar, where a faded stone plaque bore a half-effaced inscription. He ran his gloved fingers across it. "In memory of Sarah Foyle, 1832, 1869. He glanced at me. "S.F. The same initials from the hearth," I said. "Indeed, and not merely coincidence, I suspect. Lady Frances's obsession with these initials, her belief that someone was speaking through riddles, may trace back to this grave." He stepped back, casting his eyes across the chapel's layout. She was fixated on mirrors, on watchers behind glass. A ghost, perhaps. But the truth may be simpler and crueler. Someone used the idea of Sarah Foyle, perhaps an old family ghost story, to frighten Frances, to control her, to manipulate her into isolation. We returned to the house as the morning advanced, the low sun now casting long shadows across the drawing-room floor. Thaddeus was waiting for us, a telegram in hand. "A message from Scotland Yard," he said without invitation. "It seems your Inspector Lestrade has found something." Holmes took the telegram and scanned it. His eyebrows rose. "Curious," he murmured. "A set of financial transactions under the name of Francis Woodcroft made to an untraceable alias in London. S. Foyle. Large sums, regular intervals, and then suddenly stopped 2 months ago." "Eliza," Holmes said, turning to the girl who had remained near the window. "Was Lady Frances ever visited by a man who refused to give his name?" "Yes," she said. "He always came in the evening, never through the front. Once, I saw her hand him a velvet pouch. He never spoke." Holmes's jaw tightened. "Blackmail, Watson. This entire riddle game was constructed to control her through fear and dependence. The riddles allowed the blackmailer to maintain an air of mysticism while keeping her compliance. But something changed. She stopped the payments. Likely, she found out who he was. And that sealed her fate," I said grimly. Holmes moved quickly now, his energy rising. He gathered the folio, tucked it under his arm, and motioned for us to follow. "There is still one piece unaccounted for," he said. "The gardener. We found the man, a wiry fellow by the name of Merrick, tending a row of roses near the back hedge. He regarded Holmes and me with a squint but didn't stop his work. "Merrick," Holmes said. "Were you working the evening Lady Frances died?" "Aye. I work until dusk." "Did you see anyone near the conservatory that night? Or receive any unusual instructions?" The man hesitated, then wiped his hands on his trousers. "I weren't going to say nothing, sir, but yes. Mr. Woodcroft, he told me to burn some papers. In the basin, said her ladyship left 'em, and they was private. Didn't think much of it." Holmes's eyes darkened. "Did you read any?" "One of 'em was just one line. Something about a match. Didn't understand it." Holmes looked at me and said softly, "The folio's incomplete. Thaddeus destroyed what might have been the key to decoding the whole structure, either to protect her legacy or cover his tracks." Back in the drawing room, Thaddeus was gone. "Eliza," Holmes said, turning sharply, "did he know you'd seen the man this morning?" She nodded. "I told him at breakfast." "Then we must move quickly." Holmes raced up the stairs to the study, his steps echoing against the old wood. When we burst into the room, it was empty, but the curtains were drawn, and the mirror above the fireplace was shattered, a fine veil of glass dust covering the carpet. Holmes stood frozen for a moment. "Too late," he murmured. "He's erasing himself, breaking every reflective surface she might have used to see him. Watson, get to the stables. If Thaddeus leaves this estate, we may never find him again." We descended at a run. Outside, the groom confirmed our suspicions. A carriage had left minutes ago, heading for the train station. Holmes turned to me, his expression cold and measured. "He fears exposure, but not arrest. He believes he's wrapped this so tightly in metaphor and madness that no one can prove a thing. But he's mistaken." He held up the last remaining page from the folio, the one saved from the fireplace. A riddle written in Frances's clearest hand. "When glass breaks and riddles fall, the face behind shall lose it all. Find the fire where mirrors burn, there you'll see who took the turn." Holmes's voice was like steel. "He left something behind, something even he doesn't realize is incriminating. And before the day is out, Watson, I intend to find it." Holmes moved swiftly, not with the frenzy of panic, but with the cold precision of a chess master nearing checkmate. As we strode back through the hallways of Crowsbury Lodge, he spoke little, his eyes fixed in thought, occasionally muttering fragments to himself: mirrors, fire, something left behind. Eliza followed us silently, her presence like a pale flame behind Holmes's dark silhouette. We returned to the conservatory, where Holmes began a second, more thorough inspection. This time, he paid no mind to the ornamental plants or the stained marble basin. Instead, he turned his attention to the far wall, where an ornate panel of polished wood had long served as mere decoration. "This wall is the key," he said, tapping gently on the wood until a hollow echo rewarded his efforts. "You see, Watson, Lady Frances didn't simply use mirrors as metaphor, she used them physically. She built spaces to observe and reflect." He pressed against a carved fleur-de-lis at the top right corner. With a faint groan, the panel shifted inward and slid aside, revealing a narrow recess behind it, little more than an arm's depth. From within, Holmes extracted a lacquered box, its surface scorched at one edge, as if someone had attempted to set it alight before abandoning the act. He opened it carefully. Inside lay a collection of items, several folded letters, bound in a silk ribbon stained with age, a small hand mirror, cracked but intact, and a tiny velvet pouch, the same Eliza had seen passed to the nameless visitor. Holmes unfolded one of the letters and read in silence. When he looked up, his face bore the unmistakable stamp of revelation. "She knew," he said. "Lady Frances knew exactly who he was. These are drafts, unposted letters, all addressed to T.W. Thaddeus Woodcroft." "Her own brother?" I asked, incredulous. Holmes nodded. "It was he who wore the mask of smoke. He played upon her fears, cultivated her belief in unseen watchers, created a persona to hide behind S. foil using the old chapel inscription as a convenient fiction. The blackmail was only part of it. He sought not money alone, but power, control over her estate. And when she began to piece it together, when she stopped the payments and prepared to confront him, he silenced her. He held up the cracked mirror. Even this, he shattered it, not because it was incriminating, but because to her it was symbolic. A final insult. But why the riddles? I asked. Why this elaborate dance of metaphor and code? Because she feared no one would believe the truth laid bare, Holmes replied. She feared sounding mad. But riddles engage the mind. She hoped someone would find this, someone able to untangle the meaning she buried. Eliza had taken one of the letters and now read it slowly. Lips trembling, her voice broke as she read aloud. You come not with fire, but with ash. You extinguish, not ignite. And yet, I see you now, Thaddeus, behind the mirror where you hid all this time. Holmes stood. Come, Watson, we must intercept him at the station before he vanishes into the fog. We left Eliza in the care of Merrick, who, now more certain of the treachery within his employer's walls, vowed to remain by her side until we returned. The journey to the Crowsbury station took less than 15 minutes by carriage. The mist was thick by then, blurring shapes and bending sound, and the platform was sparsely populated. Holmes stepped onto the platform just as the 9:15 to London was pulling in. He scanned the figures quickly, then pointed. There. A man in a black coat and bowler hat stood near the far end, glancing behind him, half obscured by steam from the engine. Holmes was upon him in moments. Going somewhere, Mr. Woodcroft? Holmes said coldly. Thaddeus turned, his face a picture of disdain. You have no authority to stop me. No, Holmes agreed, but Scotland Yard will, and I imagine you won't wish them to discover what's in that satchel. He nodded toward the leather bag clutched in Thaddeus's right hand. The man made a sudden motion, as though to flee, but Holmes was faster. With one firm hand, he grasped the man's wrist, twisting just enough to cause the bag to fall. It struck the ground, bursting open. Documents spilled forth, ledgers, letters, bank receipts, all bearing the alias S. Foyle and detailing a long string of payments, transfers, and withdrawals that tied back unmistakably to Lady Frances. Thaddeus froze. You played your part too well, Holmes said quietly. Constructed riddles not to enlighten, but to confuse. A theater of shadows and smoke, as I suspected. But you forgot, the truth is more durable than illusion. I did it to protect our name, Thaddeus said bitterly. Frances was unstable. You saw her, babbling about watchers and ghosts. I didn't blackmail her at first, I managed her. Then she turned on me. I had no choice. Holmes's expression was colder than I had seen it in years. You had every choice. You simply chose power over love, fear over truth. The police arrived shortly, and after, summoned by Holmes's prior telegram to Lestrade. Thaddeus was taken into custody with little ceremony, his defiance already crumbling. We returned to Crowsbury by noon. Eliza waited in the drawing room, the cracked mirror still in her hands. She stood as Holmes entered, her eyes searching his face. It's over, Holmes said simply. He won't hurt anyone else. She nodded slowly, then looked toward the windows, where the sun had finally broken through the clouds, illuminating the garden paths with pale gold. There was always someone watching, she said. But maybe it wasn't a ghost. Maybe it was her, Frances, trying to be seen. Holmes was silent for a long moment. She succeeded, he said. In her own way, she reached us. Later, as we prepared to depart Crowsbury Lodge for good, Holmes paused beneath the broken study mirror. He studied the jagged remains of glass, then turned to me. Do you know what fascinates me about riddles, Watson? What's that? They are constructed from absence. What's missing? What isn't said? The spaces between the lines. He tapped the mirror gently. And yet, When solved, they reveal the clearest truths. Lady Frances was murdered, but her riddles brought us justice. He gave one last look around the room before donning his coat and hat. Come, Watson. Let us return to Baker Street. I suspect we'll find less poetry and more brandy there. As we stepped into the waiting carriage, I found myself glancing back at the windows of Crowsbury Lodge, half expecting to see a pale face at the glass, smiling in quiet triumph. But there was only sunlight and silence. The journey back to London was somber, the countryside rolling past our carriage windows in muted hues of green and grey. Holmes was unusually silent, eyes closed as though asleep, though I knew from the minute twitch of his fingers that his mind remained busily at work, reassembling the sequence of events, searching for the smallest fault, the finest detail out of place. As for myself, I was left in the grip of that familiar mixture of relief and unease that so often followed the resolution of one of Holmes's darker cases. Justice achieved, yet only by way of tragedy. Baker Street welcomed us with the familiar creak of the stair, the scent of old books and lamp oil. Mrs. Hudson had, in her wisdom, prepared a pot of strong tea and a supper of cold meats and pickled onions. Holmes sat at his desk, the folio of riddles spread before him once again, his fingertips lightly brushing the margins as though in search of some last, hidden message. He remained in this state for some time, not speaking until the lamplight grew soft, and Mrs. Hudson had come and gone twice more. "You see, Watson," he said at last, "there is a peculiar symmetry to it all. Frances believed herself hunted by a spectre, an invisible watcher. In reality, she was preyed upon by her own kin, but it was her penchant for riddles, her habit of encoding truth, that ultimately exposed Thaddeus. The mind that shaped its own labyrinth also designed the map that led us out." I nodded, recalling the cracked mirror, the folio, the hidden box. All pieces set in place by a woman whose fears had become her only means of self-defense. Yet, even now, Holmes, I wonder if justice alone can repair what has been broken at Crowsbury Lodge. Eliza, she has lost everything. The estate, her patron, her place in the world. What becomes of her? Holmes's gaze softened. "There are wounds the law cannot heal, Watson, but I suspect Eliza is not as helpless as you imagine. She possesses resilience, a mind sharpened by necessity. I have already written to a friend at the Lyceum Theatre. Her talent for verse and memory would find better use there than in a house of shadows." As he spoke, a knock came at the door, hesitant, polite. I rose to answer and found Inspector Lestrade. Hat in hand, his expression a mixture of triumph and chagrin. "Evening, Dr. Watson." "Holmes." He inclined his head, entering the room with the ease of long acquaintance. "Thought you'd like to know," Woodcroft broke his silence. "Not a full confession, but enough. The bank records, the forged correspondence, the gardener's statement, they tie him neatly to the blackmail. We'll see him stand trial for murder." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "And the question of motive?" Lestrade pursed his lips. "Inheritance, primarily. The estate was to pass to Frances, and failing her, to Eliza. She's distantly related, it turns out, through a forgotten cousin on the Foyle side. Woodcroft stood to lose everything unless he controlled them both. With Frances gone, Eliza would have been easy to coerce. He underestimated them both, and you." Holmes smiled faintly. "He underestimated the power of a mind in distress, and the clarity that comes when desperation strips away pretense." Lestrade drew out a final scrap of evidence, a letter, its seal already broken. "This was found among Frances's effects. Addressed to you, Holmes." Holmes took the letter with a slight frown and read it aloud. "If this reaches you, then I have failed. But riddles were always my defense, and mirrors my shield. Look not for ghosts, but for the hand that moves behind them. Should my voice falter, know this: the truth hides in reflection, and so, too, does justice." He folded the letter slowly, his voice hushed. "She understood her fate, Watson. She fought for the truth, even at the cost of her own life. A quiet fell over the room. The fire hissed and settled, the bustle of the street drifting up through the window in the distance. Holmes stood, gazing into the darkness beyond the glass, his silhouette framed by the lamplight. "I have often wondered," he mused, "if the world divides between those who see riddles everywhere and those who solve them." Frances was the rare soul who did both. She was her own adversary and her own champion. We spoke little more that night, both of us lost in thought, the strange afterglow of the case lingering well into the small hours. It was not until the first birds began their tentative calls along Baker Street that Holmes finally broke the silence. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you recall the last riddle?" I nodded, retrieving the final slip of paper from the folio. "When glass breaks and riddles fall, the face behind shall lose it all. Find the fire where mirrors burn. There you'll see who took the turn." Holmes smiled, not with triumph, but with respect. She left nothing to chance. She orchestrated the denouement with the same care as the blackmailer staged his illusions. It was a duel of minds, hers and Thaddeus's, and she ensured the truth would outlive her. Dawn was breaking now, the faintest pink stealing through the smog. Holmes poured a measure of brandy, passing one to me, and together we drank to the memory of Lady Frances, whose riddles had outwitted the darkness of Crowsbury Lodge. At last, Holmes leaned back in his chair, eyes already drifting toward the untidy pile of unanswered correspondence at his elbow. "Come, Watson," he said. "Let us turn the page. London will not run short of mysteries, nor, I think, of those who speak in riddles." The case was closed, but its echo remained, lingering among the dust motes and gaslight, a silent tribute to the power of truth concealed and of riddles solved. The days that followed our return to Baker Street were quietly restless, marked by a peculiar sense of emptiness, a familiar malaise that so often accompanied the aftermath of Holmes's most intricate cases. It was as if the very walls of our rooms retained an echo of the riddles and shadows that had consumed our attention for so long, the silence now as laden as the air after a thunderstorm. I busied myself with a backlog of medical correspondence, yet my mind wandered ceaselessly to Crowsbury Lodge, to Eliza's uncertain fate, and to Lady Frances, whose peculiar strength had shaped the whole tragic drama. Holmes, though outwardly returned to his routines, was not himself. He declined invitations from Scotland Yard and refused several cases brought by anxious clients. For hours he sat at the window, smoking in silence, the folio of riddles never far from reach. One morning, after a particularly long vigil, he broke his stillness to address me. "You perceive, Watson, that what most troubles me about the Woodcroft affair is not what we discovered, but what remains unresolved. A case, when closed, should settle like dust on a polished table. This one stirs yet, as though some element lies unaccounted for." I closed my notebook, sensing that this was not idle musing. "What do you believe remains, Holmes?" He tapped his fingers against the folio, eyes distant. "The riddles, Watson, their structure. They guided us to the truth, yes, but several of them allude to events or secrets never revealed in our investigation. Listen." He leafed through the pages and read aloud. "A house of glass reflects the night, but one pane cracks with hidden light. The watcher's eyes, so keen, so clear, cannot see what's buried here." He turned the page. A match, a mask, a whispered name, all lost before the morning came. The riddle's end is not the close. One secret only Frances knows. He closed the folio, regarding me with that unsettling intensity I had come to associate with the opening of a new line of inquiry. "There is another secret, Watson. Frances did not commit her entire defense to the hands of justice. She buried something, a fact, a truth still hidden from all eyes but hers." Before I could respond, a commotion erupted in the stairwell, and Mrs. Hudson appeared, flustered, announcing a visitor. Eliza Dane entered, her countenance changed since we had last seen her at Crowsbury. The haunted look was replaced by a quiet determination. She wore a plain but well-made dress, and in her hands she clutched a small, leather-bound notebook. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I hope I do not intrude." "But not at all, Miss Dane. Please, come in," Holmes said, indicating the chair by the fire. She sat, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. "I wish to thank you both. The authorities have been kind. The estate is complicated, but I am to inherit, as Lady Frances intended. But that is not why I came." She held out the notebook. "This was left for me, hidden beneath a loose board in the study, behind the fireplace. It is her diary, Frances's. She addressed it to me, and to you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes took the book reverently, his fingers moving across the cover as if deciphering a code. He opened to the first page. There, in Lady Frances's elegant script, was written, "To the one who finds this, if you have solved my riddles, you have done more than I dared hope. But if you would truly understand, seek the truth, not in glass or shadow, but in the past. The fire that started all this burns beneath Crowsbury still. There are bones no one has seen." Holmes looked up, meeting Eliza's steady gaze. "Do you know what she meant?" Eliza shook her head. "Only that Frances always feared the past more than any living soul." Holmes closed the diary and stood abruptly. "Watson, pack your bag. We are returning to Crowsbury at once. The case is not yet done." The journey was a blur of haste, our carriage racing northward, the countryside smeared by rain on the windows. As we drew near, the fields around Crowsbury seemed somehow changed. The yew trees more stooped, the air heavier, as if the land itself anticipated a final reckoning. Upon arrival, we were greeted by Merrick, the loyal gardener, who explained that the house had stood quiet. Holmes, with a single-minded energy, led us at once to the study. There, he dropped to his knees and probed beneath the hearth with a knife, prying at the loose boards until one shifted, revealing a hidden compartment below. Inside, amid dust and ancient cobwebs, lay a rusted tin box. Holmes lifted it free and, with Eliza's consent, forced the brittle lock. Within were a handful of yellowed documents, a locket containing a lock of hair, and a single sheet of paper on which was scrawled a confession. "I, Edward Woodcroft, admit that in the spring of 1888, I struck Sarah Foyle in anger. She fell her head upon the hearthstone. I hid her in the chapel crypt. Frances saw. I made her promise silence. I feared the shame more than the gallows. Forgive me, Frances. Forgive me, Sarah." The room was silent, save for the sound of the wind outside and the faint, shuddering breath of Eliza. Holmes read the note a second time, then looked to the locket. Inside, a single faded photograph, a young woman, bright-eyed and familiar, bore the inscription, S. F. All those years, Frances bore the secret for her father. "It destroyed her, didn't it?" Holmes spoke softly. "It did. The watcher in the mirror. The riddles. The haunted air of the house she carried, a burden not of her own making. Her father's crime was the rot beneath it all. With the truth unearthed at last, the spell that had gripped Crowsbury was broken. The authorities were summoned. The crypt beneath the chapel revealed the remains, confirming the confession. Lady Frances's riddles, it seemed, had done more than solve her own murder. They had delivered justice for a crime long forgotten. That night, as Holmes and I sat with Eliza by the hearth, a new peace seemed to settle upon the old house. The shadows no longer trembled with secrets. Frances's riddles had led, at last, to the truth she so desperately wished to see revealed not just for herself, but for the restless spirit she could never name. As the fire burned low, and Eliza drifted into a quiet sleep, Holmes regarded the cracked mirror above the mantel. "It is, as I said, Watson. The power of a riddle is not in the answer, but in the persistence of the question." He smiled, not with pride, but with a profound, quiet sorrow. And in the stillness of that room, it seemed to me that, for the first time in many years, the house at Crowsbury Lodge was finally at rest. Holmes lingered in the study long after Eliza had retired for the night, his silhouette stark against the faint glow of the dying fire. I watched him from my place in the old armchair, unwilling to disturb the deep current of his thoughts. Crowsbury Lodge, so recently the stage for dread and deception, now seemed to hold its breath, as if unsure how to exist without its riddles and ghosts. For a long time, Holmes said nothing. He turned over the tin box and the locket again and again in his hands, as though their contents might change if only he looked closely enough. I sensed the rare burden of empathy upon his features, mingled with the profound satisfaction that only a fully solved mystery seemed to provide. Eventually, he spoke softly, so as not to wake Eliza or rouse the uneasy spirits that had been laid to rest. "Watson, there is a peculiar kind of loneliness that settles over a house emptied of secrets. The air becomes clearer, yet there is something mournful in its clarity." I nodded, for I too felt it, a solemnity that often followed such cases, a recognition that beneath every solved puzzle lay the remnants of real suffering and loss. Holmes straightened, his mind once again turning from reflection to deduction. "There is a matter I cannot leave unaddressed." Frances's riddles were her defense, yes, but they were also a map one she hoped would lead us here, to this truth. Yet I believe she also intended them as a guide for Eliza, to ensure she never doubted her own worth or place. I suspect there may be one final message meant for her alone. He gathered the folio, Frances's diary, and the rusted tin box, then beckoned me to join him as he climbed the stairs to Eliza's small room on the upper floor. The corridor was silent, and our footfalls muffled by a runner worn thin over decades of use. Holmes knocked softly. After a moment, Eliza answered, wrapped in a shawl but awake, her expression clear and watchful. "I'm sorry to disturb you," Holmes began, his tone gentle, "but there is one riddle left unsolved, one that belongs to you." She welcomed us in and sat on the edge of her bed, her hands folded in her lap. Holmes placed the folio and the diary before her, then opened the diary to a page marked with a pressed violet. Eliza read, her voice barely above a whisper. "For Eliza, if the glass is broken and the smoke has cleared, know that what you find in ashes is not loss, but freedom. This house is yours. The secrets were never meant to bind you, but to set you free. Frances." A silence followed, thick and heavy with relief. Eliza traced her finger over the words as if drawing strength from them. "I was so afraid," she murmured. "Afraid that all I would inherit was her fear, her sadness, that the riddles would never end." Holmes shook his head. "Frances saw you as her confidant and her hope. Her riddles preserved the truth, not just for herself, but to shield you from manipulation. With the past laid bare, you may build your own future, unclouded by the old darkness." Eliza closed the diary and looked at us both, the weight of years lifting from her brow. "Thank you for everything." Holmes smiled, a rare, warm expression that was more eloquent than any congratulation. "It was Frances who led us. We were merely the instruments." She stood, offering Holmes the locket. "I think she would want you to have this, as a remembrance." He took it, visibly moved, then wished her a restful night and withdrew. We made our way back to the study, both of us quieter for the encounter. The following morning dawned bright and clear, a sharp contrast to the previous days of mist and rain. Sunlight filtered through the east windows, revealing the age and beauty of the house anew. Holmes, who had rarely shown much patience for the sentimental, suggested that we walk the gardens before departing. I agreed, eager for the clean air and the sight of the world restored to ordinary color. We strolled through the overgrown paths, the dew sparkling on leaves, the chapel ruins looming silent and benign. There, beside the fallen arch, Holmes paused, gazing at the entrance to the crypt. "It is strange, Watson, how the living can be held captive by the secrets of the dead. Frances was a prisoner, but she was also her own gaoler. In the end, it was her courage that unlocked the door. We stood in silence, each lost in thought. After a time, Holmes turned toward the house, a renewed purpose animating his steps. "I am reminded, my dear friend," he said, "that every case, however intricate, is ultimately about the restoration of balance. Here, at last, justice has brought peace, not only to the victims, but to those left behind." Our carriage awaited us at the drive, and Merrick, the gardener, bid us farewell with a grateful nod. As we departed, I looked back at the lodge, now basking in the morning sun, its windows reflecting the world without distortion or disguise. The house no longer seemed haunted, but full of possibility. The journey to London passed in a reflective quiet. Holmes's mood lightened as the city's familiar outlines appeared. Once in our rooms, he poured 2 glasses of sherry and handed one to me. "To riddles and revelations, Watson," he said, raising his glass. "And to those brave enough to speak in riddles when the truth is too dangerous to utter plainly," I replied. We drank, and Holmes settled into his chair, a faint smile curling on his lips as he pulled the locket from his pocket and set it atop the mantel. "There will be more mysteries, Watson," he said, "but tonight, let us honor the ones we have already solved." Outside, the city bustled as ever, but inside 221B, the peace was as complete as I had ever known it. The shadows held no menace, and for once, both Holmes and I allowed ourselves the comfort of rest, knowing that, for now, the riddle had truly been answered. The days slipped by in London, a welcome monotony settling over Baker Street. Our lives returned to their ordinary pattern. Holmes alternated between bursts of frenetic activity, bending over some experiment, filling the air with odd smells and stranger hypotheses, and spells of silent, contemplative withdrawal by the window. I resumed my practice and attended to patients. Yet the echoes of Crowsbury's riddles lingered, resurfacing at odd hours, as if some part of my mind still wandered those shadowed corridors. Holmes, for his part, was not so easily detached. I would find him at times gazing at the locket Frances had left behind, or leafing once more through the battered folio of her riddles, his expression one of quiet respect tinged by a sorrow he seldom allowed the world to see. But he was not brooding. Rather, I sensed he was meditating on the curious power of language, and the odd truth that sometimes only through enigma can the deepest secrets be told. A week after our return, a letter arrived, this time addressed in the firm, clear hand of Eliza Dane. I recognized it at once and handed it to Holmes, who opened it without delay. He read aloud, his voice steady but colored with unmistakable warmth. "Dear Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson, I wish to write, not merely to thank you for all you have done, though I shall never have words enough for that, but to tell you that peace has, at last, returned to Crowsbury. The authorities have cleared the old crypt, and Sarah Foyle has been laid to rest with proper rites. The air in the house feels lighter, strange, perhaps, but true. I have taken up the management of the estate, with Merrick's help, and hope to transform the lodge into a place of comfort, not secrets. I have also found, in Frances's papers, an unfinished book of riddles. I have begun to edit them myself, to publish them, as she always dreamed. It is my way of honoring her memory, and, I hope, of laying the last ghosts to rest. You are both always welcome here, should you ever wish to visit the Fens again." With deepest gratitude, Eliza Dane Holmes set the letter down, his eyes bright. "There, Watson, what better evidence could we wish for that our labors have borne good fruit? It is rare indeed," I said, "for a case to resolve itself so cleanly in the end." He looked out the window, the late afternoon sun gilding the edge of his profile. Cleanly, perhaps, yet not simply. Every step was marked by suffering, by courage, and by the kind of small decisions that shape fate. We may have found the truth, but it was Frances, in her riddled language, who showed the way. I poured us both a cup of tea, and the quiet of the room was companionable, our thoughts drifting back over the labyrinthine paths of the investigation. I found myself recalling Frances's final riddle and the odd sense of trust she placed in Holmes, in us, to see beyond confusion and doubt. Holmes broke the silence, his tone reflective. "You recall what I said about riddles, Watson, that their power lies in absence?" Frances understood that perfectly. She left gaps to be filled not only by me, but by those who came after her. Her riddles were not merely a shield, but a beacon. We were interrupted by Mrs. Hudson bearing a telegram. Holmes received it with a practiced hand, scanning it in an instant. His mouth curved in a faint, almost mischievous smile. "Well, it seems our reputation for unpicking tangled webs remains secure," he said. "Inspector Lestrade requests our presence at the yard. A matter of forgeries and missing. Papers mundane, perhaps, but possibly enlivened by a touch of intrigue. Shall we?" I smiled, finding comfort in the old familiar cadence. "Of course, Holmes. London's secrets won't unravel themselves." As Holmes prepared his coat and cane, I glanced again at Eliza's letter, letting the words settle. The ghosts of Crowsbury were finally at rest, but the world, I knew, would never be short of mysteries or of those whose truths are hidden behind riddles and masks. We left Baker Street as the evening lamps were being lit, Holmes's stride brisk, his eyes sharp once more. A trace of Crowsbury lingered in his manner, the humility of a man who has glimpsed the cost of darkness and the grace of bringing light. And so we stepped into the restless night, two friends bound by curiosity and the promise of a new enigma, the city's pulse quickening around us. The case of the girl who spoke in riddles was closed, but as Holmes said, "There is always another page, Watson, always another riddle." And with that certainty, beneath the watchful gaslight of Baker Street, the adventure continued. The evening air outside Baker Street was crisp and faintly perfumed with the first hints of late spring, a time when London seemed to hold its breath between the greyness of winter and the promise of summer. Holmes and I walked at a brisk pace, our boots tapping a measured rhythm along the flagstones. Though the shadows stretched long across the cobbled streets, I detected a new lightness in my companion's step, as though the burdens of the Crowsbury case had been quietly exchanged for the tantalizing possibility of a new challenge. Holmes said little as we made our way towards Scotland Yard, his keen eyes scanning the cityscape. The familiar landmarks passed in silent procession, the gaslit arcades, the swirling fog in the low places by the river, the hum of hansoms and foot traffic. At last, we arrived at the yard, where Inspector Lestrade awaited us in his cramped, paper-cluttered office. "Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming on such short notice," Lestrade said, gesturing for us to sit. His manner was businesslike but tinged with respect and acknowledgement, I sensed, of the manner in which Holmes had recently outmaneuvered not only criminals, but the veils of madness and memory at Crowsbury Lodge. Holmes inclined his head politely. "Your note mentioned forgeries and missing documents. I assume there is something in the case that resists the usual tools of the yard." Lestrade nodded, drawing a thin folder from a pile on his desk. "It's a rather curious matter, Holmes. The case concerns a series of forged bonds government issue, but made to look as if they were recently discovered among the effects of an old banker, one Charles Felgate. His heirs have attempted to claim them, but their provenance is in question. What's more, the solicitor responsible for managing the Felgate estate, a Mr. Augustus Prothero, has disappeared. No note, no witness, simply gone 2 nights ago." Holmes flicked through the documents quickly, his brow furrowing in thought. "And your own assessment, Lestrade?" "I would say the heirs are either victims of a sophisticated swindle or else complicit. But the bonds are impressively wrought so well, in fact, that the Bank of England's own experts wavered before pronouncing them counterfeit. Prothero's disappearance muddies the waters considerably." Holmes was silent for a moment, then placed the papers aside. "Have there been any threats? Any demands for ransom?" Lestrade shook his head. "None. Nor has there been evidence of violence. Prothero's rooms were in order, his effects untouched, save for the missing ledger in which he kept a record of Felgate's holdings. I found myself thinking of Francis's riddles, and the way a clever mind could twist truth and illusion until neither could be easily distinguished. Holmes seemed to share this thought, for he smiled slightly and said, "It is a curious fate, Lestrade, for a man to vanish and a fortune to appear in the same week. I will call on Mr. Prothero's chambers this evening. Perhaps Watson and I will spot a detail your excellent men have missed." Lestrade nodded, relief clear on his face. "I was hoping you'd say so." We left the yard as the city's lamps blazed in earnest, the dusk thickening into night. Holmes was thoughtful as we hailed a cab for Gray's Inn, where Prothero's lodgings were situated among the austere brick buildings and sycamore trees. "Observe, Watson," Holmes said as we approached the barrister's residence. "There is a subtle logic at work here, vanishing men and counterfeit wealth, all tied to a dead man's legacy. It is as though the facts themselves are arranged in the manner of a riddle, awaiting a solution in the negative space." A constable met us at the door, and with the yard's permission, allowed Holmes to inspect the premises. Prothero's chambers were neat, even to the point of austerity, a desk with orderly stacks of papers, a shelf of law books, a battered valise beneath the bed. Holmes moved through the rooms with a peculiar grace, his gaze missing nothing. He paused at the desk, running his fingers along its surface. "Note, Watson, the dust is undisturbed except here, by the inkwell. Someone replaced a pen recently. And see this scrapings on the floor by the hearth. Someone dragged something heavy, but there is no matching mark on the rug." He bent, examining the skirting. With a sudden motion, he pressed at a panel beneath the windowsill. It gave way with a faint click, revealing a hidden recess. Holmes reached in and retrieved a slim, leather-bound volume. "The missing ledger," he announced, leafing through the pages, "filled with the late Mr. Felgate's accounts, and here, at the back, a cipher of some sort." As Holmes studied the markings, a flicker of excitement danced in his eyes. "It appears, Watson, that Prothero left us a final puzzle. Note the code, a series of numerals and letters, possibly an index or an anagram. The logic is familiar mathematical, yet with a touch of poetry." He pocketed the ledger and rose, scanning the room one last time. "There is nothing more to be gleaned here tonight. We must return to Baker Street and put our minds to this cipher." Back in our rooms, Holmes wasted no time. He set the ledger before him and drew out pencil and notepaper. "The pattern here is reminiscent of Francis's riddles, Watson. Look, each number corresponds to a letter, and the groupings suggest a message concealed within the ledger's accounts." We worked late into the night, piecing together fragments, testing theories. At last, Holmes straightened, satisfaction in his tone. "It is as I suspected. The cipher spells out a warning. The bonds are false, seek the black ledger. The forger wears the banker's face." He looked up, his expression sharpened by the thrill of pursuit. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall call on the Felgate heirs. I fancy this case is more than the sum of its parts. There is a riddle here, and as with all riddles, the answer is hidden in plain sight." So, as the first light crept over the rooftops of London, Holmes prepared his plans for the day ahead. The shadows of Crowsbury at last replaced by the bright promise of a new and worthy challenge. The city, restless and infinite, awaited our next step, and I, as ever, was ready to follow where Holmes's keen mind would lead. Morning brought a bracing clarity to both Holmes and myself, banishing any lingering haze from the labors of the previous night. After a quick breakfast, Holmes gathered the ciphered ledger and signaled for a cab. The city outside seemed swept clean by recent rain, brighter, sharper, as though the very air anticipated revelation. Our first destination was the address of Charles Felgate's eldest heir, a rather dour man named Lionel Felgate, who resided in a tall, respectable house on a quiet street off Russell Square. Holmes had arranged our interview with his customary blend of tact and insistence. As we ascended the stone steps, he spoke to me in a low voice. "We must watch for the unsaid, Watson. If Prothero's warning holds, the forger has a stake here, and may well be closer than the family knows." Lionel Felgate greeted us stiffly, his appearance as meticulous as his surroundings. Every surface in the parlor gleamed, and the ticking of a clock seemed to dictate the rhythm of our visit. Holmes introduced us as acting for the Yard, and Lionel's demeanor turned guarded. "I assume this concerns the bonds," he said, lips tightening. "I can only repeat what I have told the police. I know nothing of their origin. They were found among father's things." Holmes nodded politely. "A perplexing situation. I wonder, might we examine the boxes in which the bonds were discovered? Sometimes a detail overlooked proves critical." Lionel hesitated, but pride won out over suspicion. He led us to a rear room, where 2 battered trunks stood open amid stacks of ledgers and yellowed correspondence. Holmes crouched and examined the lock of the nearest trunk, running a fingertip inside the rim. He straightened, eyes keen. "You had these in storage for some years?" Lionel nodded. "Since my father's death. Only recently did I sort through them." Holmes withdrew a scrap of paper, wedged in the hinge, a torn envelope, its wax seal barely legible. "Watson, look here." "Prothero, Gray's Inn," addressed in a shaky hand, but dated some 6 months after Charles Felgate's death. Lionel frowned. "That's impossible. Prothero handled father's affairs, but no one in the family had cause to write him after the estate was settled." Holmes's gaze lingered on the torn seal. "Curious. Mr. Felgate, who else had access to these trunks before your recent search?" "My younger brother, Simon, perhaps. He took little interest. He is not the sort to—" "Let us speak to him," Holmes interjected. Simon Felgate was summoned, a nervous, reedy man with ink-stained fingers and a habit of glancing toward the window as if seeking escape. Holmes addressed him gently. "Simon, did you examine the trunks before your brother?" Simon shook his head, then stopped, uncertain. "Only once. I was looking for old photographs, nothing more. I did notice a bundle of blank certificates tucked in the side pocket, but assumed they were meaningless. I put them back." Holmes leaned in, voice softer. "And you told no one?" "No, sir." Holmes's eyes flickered. Something unseen passed between him and Simon, a recognition that the younger Felgate's innocence was likely genuine. Holmes rose. "Thank you. One last thing, your father's signet ring. Do either of you possess it?" Lionel glanced at his brother, then back at us. "It went missing shortly before father's death. We never found it." Holmes pressed the matter no further. As we departed, he whispered, "The signet, Watson, a perfect tool for validating forgeries, if, indeed, the forger wore the banker's face." Back in the cab, Holmes reviewed the ciphered warning and Prothero's ledger, his thoughts turning swiftly. "We must find the missing ring, Watson. It is the keystone. Without it, the forger could not stamp the false bonds with Felgate's crest. Our next step is to examine Prothero's private office at Gray's Inn once more, and then consult the staff someone must have seen who came and went in the days before his disappearance." At Gray's Inn, the porter recalled an odd visitor the night Prothero vanished. "A well-dressed man, sir, short, with a limp, carried a cane. Came asking for Mr. Prothero after hours. I thought nothing of it at the time, looked like a solicitor himself." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Did he leave a name?" "No, sir. But he wore a heavy signet ring, kept fiddling with it." Holmes's lips drew into a thin line. "Thank you. Watson, I believe our quarry is not a Felgate, but a solicitor, a colleague of Prothero's, perhaps even an old rival." We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes pored over the legal directories and recent case notes from the Law Society. His search was swift, methodical. Here one Ernest Dalrymple, formerly Prothero's partner, left the firm under a cloud of suspicion 3 years past. Short, a limp from a riding accident, and, as noted in the Society's notes, fond of antique jewelry. Holmes stood, his whole frame alive with certainty. Dalrymple forged the bonds, using the missing signet, planted the false documents, and then lured Prothero to a meeting, likely to silence him when he realized the scheme was discovered. As evening drew in, Holmes and I, accompanied by Lestrade, found Dalrymple at his modest lodgings in Bloomsbury. At first he protested, then, under the evidence of the signet ring found in his desk and the detailed cipher in Prothero's ledger, he crumbled. The confession was complete. He had forged the bonds and lured Prothero away, intending only to threaten him, but a struggle ensued. Overcome with panic, he hid the man's body in an unused cellar beneath their old offices, which the police soon confirmed. As the night deepened and Dalrymple was led away, Holmes and I walked in silence along the lamplit streets, the hum of the city all around. The case, though distinct from the riddles of Crowsbury, bore the same lesson. Truth. But it is never wholly lost to those willing to look deeply enough. Holmes's voice broke our shared reverie as we approached Baker Street. The world, Watson, is full of riddles, some cruel, some tragic, but all, in the end, waiting for the mind that will see their answer. And as we stepped inside, I knew another case had been brought from darkness to light, guided, as ever, by Holmes's relentless, questioning mind. The closing of the Dalrymple affair brought with it a sense of completion, both rare and precious in our long experience of crime and mystery. Scotland Yard, satisfied at last by a confession, expressed their gratitude, though Holmes, as ever, dismissed their praise with a wry smile and a flick of his hand. For my part, I felt a measure of relief that went beyond the mere resolution of a case. There was something restorative about seeing justice achieved not by brute force, but by the patient unraveling of clues, the delicate art of logic, and above all, the refusal to accept appearances when truth might yet lie beneath. Back at Baker Street, the city's muffled pulse beating faintly beyond the window, Holmes sat in the lamplight, the locket from Crowsbury now resting on the mantel above the fire. The evening had grown quiet. He smoked in thoughtful silence, gazing at the curling ribbons of smoke as though they might spell out some new, unsolved enigma. At last he spoke. "It is a curious thing, Watson. We began with a girl who spoke in riddles, and found ourselves traversing a labyrinth of secrets, some ancient, some new. Each riddle, each cipher, was less a barrier than a guidepost, pointing us on until, at last, the entire web lay plain. Remembering Eliza's letter and the transformed peace of Crowsbury Lodge. It is rare, Holmes, that a story so filled with darkness should end in light. Frances's riddles brought justice not only for herself, but for Sarah Foyle and for Eliza as well. Even in death, she protected those she cared for." Holmes's expression softened, his keen eyes losing some of their habitual sharpness. She was a remarkable mind. Watson, perhaps one of the few I would have liked to meet, mind to mind. Her riddles were not mere defenses. They were gifts, warnings for those who would harm, and beacons for those who would help. The case of the forged bonds, too, had resolved itself in the light of the same principle, that the past cannot be kept hidden forever, and that even the cleverest mask will eventually crack. I reflected, as I often did, on Holmes's unique genius, his capacity not simply to see, but to understand. Not just to gather facts, but to grasp the hidden pattern that gave them meaning. That evening, as the fire burned low and the clock struck midnight, Holmes rose and, almost ceremoniously, placed Frances's cracked mirror and her folio of riddles beside the locket on the mantel. It was his quiet act of tribute, a gesture of respect for a mind as subtle and courageous as any he had encountered. As we sat together in the hush of Baker Street, Holmes turned to me with one last thought. "You see, Watson, in the end, all true mysteries are not about villains and victims, but about the struggle for clarity amidst confusion. The greatest riddles are those that teach us something of ourselves and of the world we inhabit. The silence that followed was full, not empty. The sort of silence that accompanies the end of a great symphony. In that moment, I understood that Holmes was right. The real victory was not merely in unmasking the culprit, but in honoring the persistence of those who, in the face of fear and doubt, dared to speak in riddles until the world was ready to listen. A gentle rain began to fall outside, and I thought of the country house at Crowsbury, no longer haunted but at peace, of Eliza finding her future at last, and of all the other souls, hidden in the shadows of London, whose stories, riddles, tragedies, or triumphs might yet await the mind willing to see through to their truth. Holmes reached for his violin, and as the first tentative notes drifted through the room, I knew that another page had turned, another mystery finished, another lesson learned. For as long as there were riddles to be spoken and secrets to be solved, there would always be work for Sherlock Holmes and for those of us fortunate enough to witness his genius. And so, beneath the gaslit calm of Baker Street, the case of the girl who spoke in riddles passed quietly into legend, its echoes lingering in the lamplight, waiting for the next summons, a new enigma, a new dawn.